On a quiet summer morning in Harlem, a powerful man collapsed at his usual breakfast table. No gunshots, no warning, just a sudden end. Bumpy Johnson was dead, and standing far behind the crowd at his funeral, hiding in plain sight, was a man who shouldn't have been there at all. Frank Lucas, a man many believed had vanished, a man who once ran from Harlem in fear, and a man who would later build one of the biggest drug empires in American history. As Frank watched Bumpy's casket lowered into the ground, he whispered words no one else could hear. Not out of respect, not out of friendship, but out of regret. Because years earlier, Frank Lucas had made one decision, one phone call, that silently turned Harlem against him and destroyed everything he built in just 7 days. This isn't a story about gunfights or street wars. It's a story about power, about rules, and about what happens when ambition crosses a line it should never touch. In the mid-1960s, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a kingdom, and Bumpy Johnson was its quiet ruler. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He controlled Harlem through relationships, loyalty, and a code everyone understood. You could run numbers. You could hustle. You could make money. But there was one rule that could never be broken. No heroin in Harlem. Frank Lucas knew that rule. Everyone did. But Frank wasn't interested in rules. He was interested in becoming somebody. He came to Harlem as a teenager with nothing and worked his way up step by step. By the time he was in his 30s, he was hungry for more than survival. He wanted power. He wanted respect. And he believed he was smarter than the men who came before him. When Frank saw an opportunity to control the heroin supply directly, he didn't see danger. He saw destiny. At first, it was quiet. No noise. No attention. Just product moving through the streets faster and cheaper than anyone had ever seen. Money came in fast. Too fast. And in Harlem, nothing big stays secret for long. Word reached Bumpy Johnson in days. He didn't send threats. He didn't send soldiers. He invited Frank to sit down and talk. A calm conversation. A simple warning. Take your business somewhere else. Frank didn't listen. That decision would cost him everything. What Frank didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson didn't need violence to destroy him. He didn't need to touch him. Bumpy understood something deeper. Harlem wasn't just streets and buildings. It was people, connections, quiet loyalties built over decades. One phone call, one conversation, one favor called in at the right moment, and the strongest empire could collapse without a single shot fired. Within days, things around Frank began to feel off. Calls stopped getting answered. Deals stalled. Faces he trusted started avoiding him. The money slowed. Then the fear set in. Frank didn't know what was happening yet, but he could feel it. Something unseen was closing in. Something he couldn't fight. By the time Frank realized what that one phone call had set in motion, it was already too late. His protection was gone. His supply was unstable. His name was being whispered in places he never wanted it to reach. And the man he thought was old, outdated, and powerless had just shown him the most dangerous kind of authority there is. The kind that works in silence. This is the story of how Frank Lucas betrayed Bumpy Johnson's rule. How one mistake shattered an empire in 7 days. And why, years later, Frank Lucas would kneel at Bumpy's funeral. Not in victory, but in fear. Because some lessons don't come with gunfire. They come with consequences you never see until everything you built is already gone. Frank Lucas didn't panic right away. At first, he told himself this was normal. Business slowed sometimes. People got nervous. Harlem had a way of testing newcomers before accepting them. But deep down, he knew this felt different. Too quiet. Too sudden. The streets that once buzzed with movement now felt like they were holding their breath. When Frank walked past corners where his people used to stand, he noticed eyes turning away. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Doors closed a little faster than usual. Frank had always believed loyalty came from money. Pay people well, and they stay with you. That belief had worked his whole life. But Harlem wasn't just a marketplace. It was a network. And Frank was starting to realize he wasn't as connected as he thought. He tried calling one of his closest associates, a man who had never missed a pickup. No answer. He tried another, straight to voicemail. By the third call, Frank set the phone down slowly, staring at it like it had betrayed him. He thought back to that lunch with Bumpy Johnson. The calm voice, the steady eyes, the way Bumpy never raised his tone. At the time, Frank had mistaken that calm for weakness. Now it felt like something else. Like confidence. Like a man who didn't need to rush because he already knew how things would end. Frank decided to move through Harlem himself, to feel the streets. He drove past buildings where he kept money and product. Everything looked normal on the surface, but something was off. A landlord who used to greet him warmly barely nodded. A building superintendent avoided eye contact. Small things, easy to ignore, except when they all happened at once. That night, Frank sat alone in his apartment, replaying the past few weeks in his head. He thought about the warning he'd brushed off, about the rule he'd broken. For the first time, the idea crossed his mind that this wasn't random at all, that someone was pulling strings he couldn't see, and there was only one man in Harlem with that kind of reach. Still, Frank refused to back down. Walking away now would mean admitting he'd miscalculated. It would mean admitting Bumpy Johnson had been right. So Frank pushed harder. He sent messages. He asked questions. He tried to reassure his people that everything was under control. But the more he pushed, the more resistance he felt. It was like trying to swim against a current that kept getting stronger. Then came the rumors. Quiet at first. Whispers about attention from outside Harlem. About names being mentioned where they shouldn't be. Frank didn't know who started them, and that scared him most of all. Fear spreads faster than truth. Once it takes hold, no amount of money can stop it. Frank began to understand something he had never learned growing up. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it works through silence, through absence, through people simply deciding they don't want to stand next to you anymore. And Harlem was making a decision about Frank Lucas. Every night, he slept lighter. Every knock sounded louder. Every phone call made his stomach tighten. The empire he believed was untouchable suddenly felt fragile, like it could crack at any moment. And the worst part was not knowing how far this would go. Because somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was watching. Not rushing. Not reacting. Just waiting. And Frank Lucas had no idea how many pieces had already been moved, or how close he was to losing everything he thought he controlled. Frank Lucas started seeing the damage from angles he never expected. It wasn't just his people pulling back. It was the systems around him changing shape. A delivery that should have arrived by morning didn't show up. A routine meeting got canceled without explanation. Someone he trusted sent word that it might be better to stay quiet for a while. That phrase stuck with him. Stay quiet meant stay invisible. And in Harlem, invisibility was the first step toward being erased. Across the neighborhood, people were making choices without ever speaking Frank's name out loud. A bookie decided not to take a bet connected to him. A driver chose a different route. A landlord suddenly remembered lease rules he'd ignored for years. None of it looked dramatic. That's what made it dangerous. There was no enemy to confront, no door to kick in. Just a steady closing of space around him.
Look at that.
From another side of Harlem,
a real
Bumpy
classic.
Johnson
They don't make them like that anymore.
He didn't ask for reports. They came to him naturally. A word here, a pause there. Harlem talked to Bumpy the way a body talks to its brain. He understood the rhythm. He knew when something was breaking down. And he knew Frank Lucas was starting to feel it. But Bumpy didn't move fast. He believed impatience caused mistakes. Let the pressure work. Let the truth reveal itself. Frank, meanwhile, was fighting two battles at once. One on the streets, and one in his own head. Pride told him to stand firm. Fear told him something bigger was happening. He thought about calling Bumpy again, then stopped himself. What would he say? That he was worried? That he wanted another warning? Frank had never begged anyone in his life. He wasn't about to start now. He leaned harder on the people he still trusted, asked them to reassure others, to remind them who he was. But those conversations didn't land the way they used to. Some nodded politely. Some avoided answers. A few gave looks that said more than words ever could. They were already thinking ahead, preparing for a Harlem without Frank Lucas in it. The streets had a memory. People remembered who protected them and who endangered them. Bumpy Johnson had spent decades building credit with Harlem. Frank had spent months spending it without realizing it wasn't his. That difference was starting to show. Then there was the outside noise. Not loud, not official, just enough to make people uneasy. Questions being asked, names floating around. Nothing concrete, but enough to change behavior. Frank didn't know where it was coming from, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. When you don't know the source of pressure, you can't push back. You can only guess. Late one night, Frank sat alone again, counting money that felt heavier than it should. Not because there was more of it, but because he didn't know how long it would last. He replayed his choices, searching for the moment where things tipped. Every path led back to the same place. That lunch, that warning, that decision to ignore a rule everyone else respected. Somewhere across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was ending his evening the same way he always did, calm, measured, unbothered. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene, but the wheels were already turning. And Frank Lucas, for all his ambition and intelligence, was finally realizing the truth. This wasn't a fight he could see, and that made it the most dangerous one of his life. By the end of the week, Frank Lucas felt like he was walking through a city that no longer recognized him. Harlem
the shipment
hadn't
arrives
turned
tonight.
hostile.
Is
That
everything
would have been
secure?
easier to deal
It is,
with.
but we can't be
Instead,
seen.
It had gone cold. The warmth, the familiarity, the quiet respect he thought he'd earned were gone. People weren't angry. They were distant. And distance, Frank was learning, was more dangerous than hatred. He tried to move money from one location to another just to stay flexible. The driver he trusted hesitated, then backed out entirely, mumbling something about bad timing. Frank watched him leave and realized how fast things were slipping. Fear had replaced loyalty. Once that happened, there was no buying it back. Fear didn't care how much you paid. That same day, Frank heard about activity near one of his stash apartments. Nothing official, just neighbors talking. Too much talking, the kind that drew attention. Frank didn't go himself. He sent someone else. That man came back shaken, saying it didn't feel safe, saying it felt watched. Frank didn't ask by whom. He didn't want the answer. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson stayed exactly where he always was, at the center of everything, without ever appearing to move. People stopped by with updates they didn't even realize they were giving. A landlord mentioned concerns. A shop owner mentioned unfamiliar questions. Bumpy listened, nodded, and said very little. He didn't need to instruct anyone. Harlem already knew what side it was on. Frank's phone rang less and less. When it did ring, it was never good news. A delay, a complication, a suggestion to wait. Every conversation ended with uncertainty hanging in the air. Frank started sleeping in his clothes. He checked the window before turning off the light. He kept his thought to himself because even words felt risky now. The pressure wasn't just closing in, it was squeezing. Frank could sense that something final was approaching, though he couldn't see its shape yet. His empire, once sharp and confident, now felt fragile, like it was being held together by habit alone. And habits break under pressure. Late one evening, Frank received a call that made his chest tighten before he even answered. The voice on the other end was cautious, almost apologetic. It didn't accuse him of anything. It didn't threaten him. It simply suggested that certain paths were no longer open, and certain names were better left unspoken. When the call ended, Frank sat still for a long time, staring at the wall. He understood what that meant. This wasn't chaos. It was order being restored. Frank thought about leaving then, just packing up and disappearing before things got worse. But leaving meant surrender. It meant admitting that Bumpy Johnson had outplayed him without ever touching him. That idea burned more than fear. Frank had always believed the bold survived. Now boldness felt like a mistake. Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson finished his day the way he always did, steady, unshaken. He knew the final moments were approaching, though he hadn't forced them. He believed people revealed themselves under pressure. And Frank Lucas was revealing everything. The city felt tense, like it was waiting for something to snap. Frank stood at the edge of that moment, knowing that whatever happened next would decide whether he stayed in Harlem or vanished from it entirely. Frank Lucas thought he had reached the edge of the storm. He was wrong. What came next wasn't louder. It was sharper, more personal. One morning, he received a message that didn't come from the streets or his remaining associates. It came from someone far outside Harlem, someone who had never spoken to him directly before. The words were polite, careful, and unsettling. They hinted that certain relationships Frank depended on were suddenly complicated. That's when Frank realized this wasn't just about Harlem anymore. The walls weren't only closing in around his territory. They were closing in around his supply, his movement, his future. People he'd always assumed were untouchable were now hesitant to return calls. Routes that had been reliable for months were suddenly unavailable, and nobody explained why. They didn't need to. Silence carried the message clearly enough. Frank began to see the full picture, and it scared him more than anything else so far. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just pushing him out of Harlem. He was isolating him, piece by piece, not through confrontation, but through reach, through influence that stretched far beyond a single neighborhood. Frank had built fast. Bumpy had built deep. Frank tried to counter it. He reached out through back channels, asked questions he'd never had to ask before. The answers were vague, cautious, unfinished. People spoke like they were afraid of saying too much. That fear didn't come from Frank. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere older, somewhere established. And then came the moment that changed how Frank saw everything. A trusted contact finally spoke honestly, lowering his voice even though no one else was around. He didn't name names. He didn't explain details. He simply said, "This isn't about you anymore. It's bigger than that." That was when Frank understood the second twist of the knife. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just activated Harlem. He had reminded people of consequences they'd forgotten. Frank sat alone afterward, replaying every step that led him here. The warning, the rule, the decision to ignore it. He had thought Bumpy's power stopped at the neighborhood line. That assumption now felt naive. Harlem wasn't a cage. It was a hub, and Bumpy stood at the center of it. The tension followed Frank everywhere now. In the car, in his apartment, in the pauses between phone rings. He started to wonder who was still truly on his side, and who was just waiting for permission to walk away. That uncertainty weighed heavier than any threat ever could. Across town, Bumpy Johnson remained patient. He didn't celebrate. He didn't rush to finish anything. He believed pressure revealed truth faster than force. Frank was learning that lesson in real time. Every move he made now felt reactive, defensive, and Frank hated that feeling more than losing money. The streets felt tighter, the air heavier. Harlem was holding its breath again. Frank Lucas stood at a crossroads, knowing the next move, whether made by him or against him, would change everything. And somewhere nearby, unseen and unhurried, Bumpy Johnson was letting the final tension build, knowing the moment of collapse always came when a man believed he still had one move left. Frank Lucas finally accepted what his instinct had been trying to tell him all along. This wasn't going to turn around. There would be no comeback, no clever move that restored what he'd lost. The pressure had reached a point where every option led to the same ending. Stay, and everything would collapse publicly. Leave, and at least he would survive. For a man like Frank, survival had always been the first rule, even if pride told him otherwise. The final confirmation came quietly, not through sirens, not through confrontation, just absence. Frank went to check one last location he believed was secure. The place was untouched, but empty. No people, no movement, no loyalty left to find. That was when it hit him. The empire wasn't falling. It had already fallen. He was standing in the echo of something that no longer existed. That night, Frank packed light. No announcements, no goodbyes. He didn't tell the few people still answering his calls where he was going. He understood now that the less people knew, the safer everyone was. As he drove out of Harlem, the streets didn't stop him. They didn't chase him. They simply let him go. And somehow, that felt heavier than any threat ever could. Bumpy Johnson heard that Frank Lucas had left before the sun came up. He didn't smile. He didn't comment. He just nodded, as if the outcome had been decided long before it happened. For Bumpy, this was never about winning. It was about protecting a line that couldn't be crossed. Harlem had rules for a reason, and when those rules were tested, the response had to be firm but controlled. The neighborhood settled quickly. The tension eased. Business returned to its rhythm. People moved on, knowing the storm had passed without destroying the streets it threatened. To most, Frank Lucas became just another name that faded from conversation. A lesson, not a legend. But here's the twist few ever talked about. Bumpy Johnson never touched Frank's future. He could have pushed further. He had the reach. He had the influence. But he stopped exactly where he intended to. Frank wasn't erased. He was spared. Bumpy believed punishment worked best when it taught restraint, not when it destroyed completely. Frank leaving Harlem was a lesson. Years later, when Bumpy Johnson collapsed at Wells' restaurant and Harlem gathered to mourn him, Frank Lucas returned quietly, older, wiser, still ambitious, but changed. As he stood behind the crowd, watching the man who had dismantled him without violence, Frank finally understood the full weight of what had happened back in 1965. When he stepped up to the casket and leaned in close, his words weren't about fear. They weren't about defeat. They were about recognition. An acknowledgement that power didn't always look the way he thought it did. That one phone call hadn't just destroyed his empire in 7 days. It had spared his life and reshaped his future. And the final surprise was this. Frank Lucas would go on to build again. Bigger than before. But never in Harlem. Never crossing that line again. Because a man he truly feared wasn't alive anymore. But the lesson Bumpy Johnson taught him still was. After that funeral, Frank Lucas didn't stay long. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't draw attention. He slipped out of Harlem the same way he had slipped back in, quietly. But something inside him had shifted for good. The man who left that day wasn't the same one who had once challenged Bumpy Johnson's rule. He had learned the cost of underestimating a system built on people, trust, and memory. Frank would later rebuild his empire elsewhere, far from Harlem's borders. He became richer, more careful, more disciplined. But those who knew him closely noticed something different. He avoided certain neighborhoods. He stayed away from schools. He kept lines he never crossed again. It wasn't kindness. It was understanding. He had seen what real power looked like, and he knew when not to challenge it. Harlem, meanwhile, carried on. Bumpy Johnson's absence was felt, but his influence didn't disappear overnight. The rules he set lived on through the people who believed in them. Shop owners, residents, hustlers, and elders all remembered why those rules existed. Not to control them, but to protect what little stability they had. Harlem had survived a moment that could have torn it apart, and most people never even knew how close it came. The story of Frank Lucas and Bumpy Johnson isn't really about betrayal or crime. It's about choices. About what happens when ambition ignores responsibility. Frank believed success meant moving fast and taking risks. Bumpy believed success meant knowing when to stop. One built an empire quickly. The other built one that lasted. That one phone call everyone talks about wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't threaten or accuse. It simply reminded the right people of the right truths at the right time. And that was enough. In 7 days, an empire vanished, not because it was weak, but because it was standing alone. Years later, when Frank Lucas spoke about his past, he didn't brag about beating rivals or making money. He talked about lessons, about mistakes, and about one man who never raised his voice but still commanded absolute respect. He admitted that fear didn't always come from violence. Sometimes it came from knowing someone could end you, and chose not to. Bumpy Johnson never chased headlines. He never needed to. His legacy lived in the balance he kept, the line he drew, and the discipline he enforced without chaos. Frank Lucas lived long enough to understand that sparing someone can be more powerful than destroying them. In the end, Harlem didn't remember Frank as the man who challenged Bumpy. They remembered him as the man who learned. And that may be the most important takeaway of all. Power isn't about how much you take. It's about how much you can control without ever being seen. And the most dangerous move isn't the loud one. It's a quiet decision that changes everything long after the noise is gone.